Good day, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to Canadian Idiocy, where I'll attempt to shine a light on the not-so-proud moments of the Great White North. The topic I'll be addressing has been in Canadian news media for the better part of 2 decades. This is Omar Khadr. Omar Khadr was the Canadian-born, Pakistani-raised, admitted and convicted terrorist that took the life of medic Christopher Spear by throwing a grenade that also blinded Sergeant Lane Morris. But Omar Khadr is not the first or only member of his family to partake in such activities. His father, Omar Khadr, would eventually be exposed as a senior associate and financer of Al-Qaeda. He moved to Canada in the 1970s, where he studied computer science at the University of Ottawa. There, he met his wife, Maha El-Samna. At the university, Khadr joined the Muslim Students Association, where he came to agree with their notions of Sharia law, and became a vocal advocate for Islamic rule for his native Egypt. The Muslim Students Association still exists and is prevalent around Canadian universities today. In 1985, Omar Khadr moved to Pakistan during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, apparently to do humanitarian work. He first met Osama bin Laden as they both ran money into Afghanistan to support the battle against the Soviets. In 1986, the Khadr family moved briefly back to Canada, where Omar Khadr was born in Ontario. The Khadr family then moved directly back to Pakistan, where Omar Khadr worked for an aid organization, Human Concern International. It is an Ottawa-based organization founded on Islamic principles of charity and goodwill to humanity, which was and still is financed partly by the Canadian International Development Agency. The Human Concern International organization would later come under fire as one of the means Khadr funneled money to Al-Qaeda. In 1995, Osama bin Laden told an Egyptian interviewer that Human Concern International funded an Al-Qaeda charitable front called Blessed Relief. Khadr was in charge of Human Concern International's Pakistan office at the time. During this time, Omar Khadr frequently returned to Canada to raise funds for refugee orphans building a camp in Pakistan called Hope Village. He was recorded telling a Canadian newspaper, "They've driven the Afghan villagers out of the mountains, or simply killed them, using massive attacks by medium and heavy bombers, napalm, strafing, and poison gas." Now, as you can imagine, this tugged at the heartstrings of the Canadian people, and on the surface this looks and sounds like a noble cause. But on October 15, 2010, Mohammed Fadil, a Canadian aid worker who spent years alongside Omar Khadr, had a completely different picture of the man the media had such high esteem for. Omar Khadr asked Mohammed Fadil to fund an orphanage, but when it was learned that the orphanage had Egyptian terrorists working there, Fadil refused, and was not only met with threats, but a very attempt on his life orchestrated by Omar Khadr. Mohammed Fadil stated, "So I refused, and then Khadr looked at my face, put his finger in my face, and said, 'Do you know who I am? I can get rid of anybody in Afghanistan any minute, any time I want.'" This would not be a one-time occurrence, as Omar Khadr repeatedly plotted to have Mohammed Fadil killed. As both were working for Canadian aid groups, he apparently viewed him as a rival and a threat to his efforts to fundraise in Canada. "Khadr is not a saint," stated Mr. Fadil. "Khadr is really a jihadi. Khadr is not a charitable worker." Mohammed Fadil is a chairman at the Canadian Relief Foundation. In 1992, all of Omar Khadr's charitable fundraiser work finally catches up with him, and he is injured in a landmine blast. He returns to Canada for medical treatment, covered by the Ontario Health Insurance, but goes straight back to Pakistan as soon as he is healed. In December 1995, Mr. Khadr is arrested in Pakistan for his alleged role in a deadly bombing of the Egyptian embassy in Islamabad, with $30,000 US, and accused of aiding and abetting terrorists. "I'm Canadian," he protests. "I'm a 100% innocent person," he pleads to reporters from a hospital bed, while being held under police guard. During a hunger strike, he adds, "The last hope I have is Jean Chrétien coming." A month later, the Liberal Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, intervenes on his behalf. Jean Chrétien also meets the Khadr children, telling the eldest he hopes he grows up to be Canadian Prime Minister one day. Omar Khadr is let go weeks later. The family returns to Canada, but later moves to Jalalabad in Taliban-controlled eastern Afghanistan, where they live in Osama bin Laden's camp. Omar Khadr then starts to re-enroll his sons in Islamic military training camps in Afghanistan. In October 2001, Omar Khadr is named on a list of terrorists wanted by the FBI in connection to the September 11th terrorist attacks at the World Trade Center and Pentagon. In 2003, Omar Khadr dies during a gun battle with Pakistani security officers, revealing him as a high-profile member of Al-Qaeda who acted as deputy to Osama bin Laden. Maha El-Samna, Ahmed Carter's wife, is hardly a Mother Teresa. In a 2004 CBC PBS Frontline interview with Maha El-Samna and her daughter Zainab Carter, Maha El-Samna insisted that Al-Qaeda-sponsored training camps were the best place for her children and would like to see her children die as martyrs as her husband once did. She's quoted as saying, "Would you like me to raise my child in Canada? By the time he's 12 or 13, he'll be on drugs or having some homosexual relation, or this and that. Is that better? For me, no." Maha El-Samna and Zainab Carter went on to not only defend the killing of medic Christopher Speer, but said they were proud of Omar Khadr for doing so, calling it brave. They also praised the second eldest son, Abdurrahman Carter, for fooling the U.S. by pretending to cooperate. However, Maha El-Samna's dislike of Canadian street life came to an abrupt end in April 2004, a month after the Frontline interview. She returned to Canada with the help of Foreign Affairs that went to extraordinary measures to help them obtain exit visas from Pakistan and emergency one-time-only Canadian passports for her trip. Her youngest son, Abdul Carter, accompanied her, who had been injured in the October 2003 shootout with Pakistani security that ended Ahmed Carter's life. Family members have said that if the teenager is ever going to walk properly again, he's going to need the help of the Canadian healthcare system. Now, it was assumed Abdul Carter had been out of the country too long to qualify for Canadian universal health care, as he spent most of his life in Pakistan, and for a moment it looked like the Carters would have to flip the medical bills on their own. However, after gaining media headlines, Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin stated the Carters can call Canada their home, despite their past ties to Osama bin Laden, and regardless of the many demands that the Carters be stripped of their Canadian citizenships. After picking up healthcare forms from the Ontario Health Insurance Plan Office, the Carters were informed all they had to do was fill out the forms and wait out a 3-month residency term required to qualify for public-funded healthcare. Ontario Minister at the time, George Smitherman, confirmed that the family is entitled to public-funded healthcare. Afterwards, Maha El-Samna stated, "I'm proud of what we are, and I'm proud we're in Canada now." However, this is not the first or last time the Carters would waive their Canadian flag at convenience, or set it down. They made it quite clear they'd rather be elsewhere, having deemed Canada unfit. It seems only the lure of Canada's free healthcare and social services that compel them to call themselves Canadian. They've, in all accounts, manipulated the Canadian system. It is only Canada's immense tolerance and compassion that have allowed this situation to occur and continue. 4 years later, Abdul Carter would also be charged with 1 count each of sexual assault and sexual exploitation of a minor. Aside from the apparent special treatment the Carters have received by the Canadian government, Maha El-Samna claims her family has been treated unfairly and says she does not want her son treated as a war criminal despite his actions. If personality isn't inherited, it is most certainly learned, and Zainab Carter has learned quite well from her parents. Like her mother, she also wishes her daughter will someday die as a martyr. Apparently, she'd love that, in fact, and has gone on record saying there's no such thing as moderate Islam. "Islam is Islam," Zainab stated. "You either follow the Quran or you don't follow the Quran." Her mother interjected, "Moderate Muslims are not following the complete Quran." I, for one, cannot argue with their sentiment. Clips of this interview are shown in the documentary Son of Al-Qaeda. It doesn't have the full interview in its entirety, but I suggest you check it out. It'll be in one of the links below. Zainab Carter has been married 3 times, once to Khalid Abdullah, who was a suspect in the 1996 attack on the Egyptian embassy in Pakistan, and has been sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Her second marriage was to Yaqub Albar, which ended in a dispute due to their daughter's illness, hydrocephalus. Zainab wanted her daughter to receive treatment in Canada. Her husband insisted Pakistan hospitals would be just fine. Naturally, she ended up in Canada. Her third and so far final marriage was to Joshua Boyle, who in 2012 went missing with his pregnant new wife in Afghanistan, who would later then be confirmed to be taken hostage by the Taliban. In 2005, Zainab Carter returned to Canada to lobby for the rights of her 2 brothers and announced her presence with the assessment of Canada, "I don't like the society here." RCMP, however, were not dismayed by Zainab Carter's utter dislike of Canada and confiscated her laptop, computer, mobile phone, audio cassettes, and her diary, which, according to RCMP, unlocked a treasure trove of Al-Qaeda files, which included material dealing with bomb-making, ricin, techniques of assassination, chemicals, poisons, silencers, military operational plan to infiltrate Burma and establish an Al-Qaeda base, curriculum for religious propaganda, techniques to invade prisons, contract for immoral acts, administration letters from Osama bin Laden, etc., etc. RCMP even won an appeal to hold Zainab Khadr's belongings for longer than is usually allowed, as they unearthed extremist propaganda that could be used to incite further terrorist attacks, as well as discovering items that could assist al-Qaeda's extremist recruitment efforts, or even its future extremist operations. RCMP Sergeant Conrad Shirori wrote, "I believe that Zainab Khadr has willingly participated and contributed both directly and indirectly towards enhancing the ability of al-Qaeda to facilitate its criminal activities." He also mentioned that the entire family is affiliated with al-Qaeda and has participated in some form or another with these criminal extremist elements. Despite all this, however, Zainab Khadr had an airtight defense. She had purchased the computer second-hand 7 months prior before coming to Canada, and that anything found on the laptop except the few personal pictures and cartoons she downloaded were not hers, and that the audio cassettes simply belonged to her father. Apparently, this was good enough for the Canadian courts because nothing ever came of it. So if you're ever charged with a crime in Canada, you know your defense. Those condoms full of coke aren't mine. I don't know how they got in my stomach. Not even my stomach, really. Borrowed it from the neighbors. Now, if you think you've seen the extent of the Canadian court's incompetency, let me introduce you to the eldest Khadr's son, Abdullah Khadr. Abdullah Khadr has stated that he only ever bought and sold weapons for al-Qaeda, despite the fact he also stated he knows everybody in al-Qaeda and ran guns for the organization to the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. He admitted he began producing weapons to al-Qaeda after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and played a role in using a global positioning system unit to map coordinates for fighters who would later be arrested for trying to kill Pakistan's prime minister in a missile attack. Abdullah Khadr has proudly told interviewers, "We are one of the most famous families in Afghanistan." The United States considered him a national security threat, and even paid a bounty of $500,000 US to Pakistani military officials, who arrested Abdullah Khadr, and he was eventually extradited back to Canada. The US and Canadian government under Stephen Harper tried their best to extradite Abdullah Khadr to the US, where he faces charges that carry a maximum penalty of life imprisonment and a $1 million fine. However, it was to be all in vain. The, I can only assume, progressive Supreme Court of Canada would not hear the extradition case of Abdullah Khadr, shutting the door on the American efforts to prosecute the man in a terrorism case. Despite appeals by the U.S. Canadian governments and the argument that it was wrong to prevent an admitted terrorist from facing trial in the U.S., eventually the bid to extradite Abdullah Khadr was ended, and he was eventually freed by the Toronto court. One can only assume he now plans to pursue a career inspired by Liberal Prime Minister John Chrétien to become Prime Minister of Canada. One of the main defenses for Abdullah Khadr not being extradited to the U.S. to face terrorist charges and being freed was his apparent mistreatment at the hands of the Pakistani government, and given Pakistan's track record of human rights issues, that's hardly surprising. However, to assume Abdullah Khadr had no terrorist activities and shouldn't stand trial for the crimes he's accused of is absolutely ludicrous, to the point where I'm wondering if the dismissal of his case wasn't at least partially from a political agenda. The evidence and statements even before Abdullah Khadr was incarcerated in Pakistan more than warrants the extradition to the U.S. to stand trial. In the second part, I'll finally tackle the main protagonist, Omar Khadr, and dive into the Canadian media and how they came full circle to not only defend Omar Khadr and his family, but to also regard him as a folk hero of almost worship status, as Canada's hero Muslim terrorist.